Welcome to A Higher Future in Healthcare, where we're exploring obstacles and solutions to healthcare's growing workforce demands. Tune in to hear from thought leaders as they share their perspectives on strategy, technology, AI, and people who are paving the way for transformative change.
This would be an interesting conversation to have because, Dave, kind of, former admin across many organizations, Michael, with what you're doing, with the rural clinics and things, I imagine maybe this probably comes up quite a bit as you guys grow.
I mean, my view was, Michael, your background, HR and so on, will kind of be you kind of being the thought technical expert on all the challenges, not just in rural, by the way, UB. I mean, this is as big of an issue in an academic center in downtown, any downtown urban area, health center as it is in rural. So, and I could just kind of add some color commentary from a general executive viewpoint, whatever. But this is much more in your sweet spot, recruitment, all the challenges there right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the things, when we're talking about growing employees and how to do that and how that is just essential to the workforce, I actually think about not as much what I'm doing right now, although it will end up translating there. We're just at a little bit earlier stage. But actually my last organization, Physicians Immediate Care, and how COVID affected us so much, because when COVID first hit, it was, all hands on deck. And then eventually there was a big wave of labor that just sort of left the market for various reasons. And so it was really interesting to see how that affected us, because if you look at, and we were right at the tip of the spear. We're urgent care. So, we're seeing more patients than you could imagine. And for us, it's the position that we were really losing was our rad techs, those who were shooting x-rays, and extremely important to see what was going on doing all these chest x-rays and everything. But they had an opportunity to go back and go into the hospitals and become CT techs and MR techs and and the like. And I didn't have that growth opportunity for them. So interestingly, what I did is I pushed my team, and I had a really large training team, to dig in more and to be able to create learning opportunities to train medical assistants and create them into actually rad techs, limited rad techs. We turned that into actually a DE&I program without labeling it as one. But to turn someone who was making $20 an hour, $18 an hour, into someone who was making $85,000 an hour. So that was really how we did a lot of our training.
Wow.
Internally, solving our own problems, and the community's problems at the same time.
Yeah, you think about we've all overheard the last 6-12 months this whole issue of virtual work, and no one's returning to the workplace in general industry, right, in the general community, and that maybe COVID accelerated what was going to happen anyway, or maybe it didn't, but it recalibrated the world as we know it. No one's going to ever go back to a 5-day work week in a cubicle in an office anymore. So what's the healthcare caregiver analogy for that? Did COVID, like what you're getting at, Michael, did COVID accelerate what was possibly going to happen for caregivers in a traditional model that they were already burning out anyway? They were already dissatisfied. Things were going to change, but it just all accelerated. And now we have to figure out, how do we adjust the caregiver work life model, nurses, radiology techs, like you're saying, or anybody, what's their new world? What's the world going to be? How do we figure that out? And so on, right? Because that's what the bankers are figuring out, or all these other industries right now, where people don't want to return to a 9-to-5 cubicle Monday through Friday anymore. right?
Right. And I think the first wave that we saw was how much can we move to telehealth?
Sure.
How much do I not actually need to see a patient in, in the office at all? And I can just do it through, through Zoom or whatever. And I think pretty quickly we learned that that doesn't work. It doesn't work for, for a lot of things. It's fine for some, and for some you know, that just isn't, it's too impersonal.
Right.
And the physical touch is just necessary within healthcare.
Yeah.
But how do we find then, how do we retain and how do we recruit workers, staff who are of the mindset they don't want to go into a clinic for a 10-hour shift and have this grind of, patients in the waiting room, waiting to be roomed, waiting then to be seen, waiting to be discharged, and do that for a 30-year career. And they watched how taxing and burdensome that is to other peers or the older generation, whatever it might be. And they're coming into this saying, I don't want to do that.
Mhm.
Boy, so how do we start finding those workers? How do we match them up with our opportunities, and how do we change our jobs as well so
Well,
that we don't burn out?
I was going to say, I think there's two focuses there, and I think that's exactly it. One is you clearly have to find someone who's mission driven, who isn't going to see taking care of patients as a grind day in and day out. And the second part is you have to make taking care of patients not a grind day in and day out.
Right.
And part of that, if you're on the primary care side, is a patient visit is not a 10-minute patient visit, because as soon as you're doing that, then that is what turns it into a grind, and that is what degrades care for patients. And so we have to look at this much more holistically, not just from one side of the coin and say what's going to be driving a fee for service value, but that's also going to be burning out your staff. It's not good for your patients, and it's just not long-term sustainable. So how do, like you're asking, Dave, how do we create a different model?
Right.
Spend more time with our patients, actually get to know your patients.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Although at some point or another, I mean, I think about myself, walking around the hospital floors and watching the work world of nurses and patient care techs, particularly on a nursing unit, and how physical that job is,
mhm.
how taxing it is clinically and emotionally for them, along with obviously that physical piece. And nurses who may start their career in their early 20s, by the time they're 40 or 50, after doing it 20 or 30 years, just their own aging, let alone, the burnout factor or the repetitive burnout factor. I mean, can you expect a 50-year-old nurse who's been in career 20 or 30 years to be willing to work on a nursing floor anymore? And now the shifts have gone from 8 hours a day to 10 or 12 hours.
12 hours a day, right? No,
Right.
it's a great question.
And we haven't radically, we've created, more breaks. We used to call it, of course, I lived in Seattle at the time, so it's only kind of it's a typical West Coast thing, but we created, as we rebuilt our hospital, we created dedicated rooms in each unit called the Zen Den. For the nurses and the staff to go decompress for a little bit of time to recharge, right, when needed, and so on. I mean, yeah, we've created those things, but we hadn't, we've danced around the edges of the job.
Yeah.
The job is still very physical, very taxing, very challenging. How do we work on that? Like you're saying, Michael, how do we change that?
It's a great question. I wish I had the answers to that one.
Yeah.
So what I was going to ask around that then, so because Dave, that seems like a Band-Aid, right? Like, oh, well, we're going to come up with Band-Aid solutions to this. But to your point, like, and to address that piece of it. It sounds like what you both are saying is, you know, how do we address that in the recruitment process? How do we, and is any of this happening now where we're thinking, you know, let's say someone's coming in as a nurse and they're 25 years old, and yeah, they're going to be here till they're 50 plus. Is that even, do we even think about that in the recruitment process? That fact, or is that something now that's becoming part of the thought process because of COVID?
I think Dave was saying that's not even sustainable.
Well,
Right.
but I mean, what I'm asking is like to think ahead and to say, because yeah, totally.
It's a young kid's job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
But
I think it's so.
are
How
we
I
thinking
would
about
go,
that from the beginning is what I'm
yeah.
asking, you know, like, okay, they're coming in as a young kid, but now for this person, are we even thinking ahead to when they're 50 and they can't do this young kid's job anymore, right? What's next for them? How do we build in a journey? Because we're talking
Exactly.
about reskilling
That's
and
where
cross-training.
That's
yeah, UB,
right.
that's where I would go. I think
Right.
the macro viewpoint is how do you build a career track so
Yeah.
that when someone joins as a young clinician, nurses, PCT, whatever the role, my patient care tech, whatever the role
Right.
is, that there's a recognition that, you know, not only are their interests going to change over time, due to the repetitiveness nature of it, but also even the physicality of their work. And how do you
Yeah.
build a career track so that if you can recruit a nurse at 25 years old out of, you know, whatever training program, and they want to retire with
Correct.
you at 60 years old, that it's not all going to be 4 12-hour shifts
Yeah.
a week on a nursing floor. That,
Correct.
you know, the beginning of it may be like that, right? And then at some point it's going to evolve to have other types of intellectual challenges other than just the physical nature of nursing. And then
Right.
maybe there's care management or utilization review
Right.
or clinical quality or all the different other roles. And I'm just picking on nurses here as an example of a track that can evolve. And but you build that in up front, and then how do you recruit,
Yeah.
knowing that that's the fit, right? That
But you know, to pick on nurses, and I will, to go back even further, and I remember this 15 years ago, there was an article like, why can't we hire good nurse managers? And it's that they're not trained to be nurse managers in school. This is not, they're trained to be nurses, not managers. So this becomes the, you know, the challenge of administration and HR to put leadership training in place to grow your young nurses into nurse leaders, and exactly what Dave was talking about, into other clinical areas, because it's not sustainable to work a 12-hour shift and to move patients around when you're in your 50s. This is, you know, I'm in my 50s, and you know, I get out of bed and go, ugh, you know, and I'm not getting someone else out of bed. I'm just getting myself
Yeah.
out of bed.
yeah, wait,
So,
wait.
you
By
know,
the way, Michael, wait till you turn 60.
so right. So these are the things that I think we're talking about. Or what are these, you know, clinical paths? Or, you know, when someone got into nursing, it sounded like I can do this forever, but what does forever mean? You have to be able to move into something, whether that's leadership for some, a different clinical path for others, moving into an outpatient setting, or, you know, as Dave was even, you know, talking about, if you're looking at a PCT job, you know, does that mean you move into, now you get additional skills and now you're a medical assistant on the outside, something along those lines, right?
Yeah, it's kind of I mean, the comprehensive holistic view is, as we recruit young talent into our organization, we want to find a match for them wanting to stay with us their entire career. But our commitment back is we will let your career evolve with us so that it's not 35 years of exactly the same job as you started with us. It's
Yeah.
going to evolve over time, partly based on your interests and your capabilities, along with the organization's needs, along with where healthcare is going to go. Because I couldn't predict what 35 years from now is going to look like in healthcare from a workforce viewpoint, right? And then how do we match that with people who want to do that?
Yeah.
And I was just about to say, for some people that sounds great, and for other people it's not, because the conversation is going to be, show me exactly what my career path is going to look like, and my answer is I can't, because it's going to be dependent upon you and whatever you want to do. And certain people are going to be like, oh, that's great, or no, I want to know what my next step is and when that's going to happen and exactly where I'm going to go. But I think we're talking about a little bit more flexibility in putting it in the hands of the employees to say, I'll go wherever, just give me the time, and I'll go there. And I think that's a really exciting way to look at it.
That could also be, I would say, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that it's not necessarily just reliant on the person, though. It's also reliant on the market forces, the situation that's occurring at the time, right? Because
correct.
To your point, Michael, when you were talking about reskilling assistants to be techs now, that was almost out of necessity because of the shortage. And so what was that conversation like? So when you all talked, to assistants and said, hey, we have an opportunity, it's what did that conversation look like?
Yeah, and I think again, it sort of goes back before, because we had already created an environment in which we were a learning organization, where we had already trained medical receptionists to become medical assistants. So this was part of the organizational DNA, that you could come into this company and grow. And so those people who were willing to raise their hand, we were like, great. So this was just that, but more. They're like, oh my gosh, a licensed position. And it was somewhat dormant. And so we were also working with the state to get educational positions alive again, from the state, and the licensing going again. So it was pretty big. And so people were really excited about it. But because they already had faith that we were going to do it for them. And so I think that was part of it, is that it wasn't just like this pie in the sky kind of thing that we were doing, even though it sort of was for us, because it grew out of like a problem that we had. And we're like, okay, well, what do we do to solve this problem? Well, throw it ourselves. I don't know. Okay. But they were on board with it because of that. And that's how it happened.
But Michael, where does again, as more of a general administrative type, I always look to, how do you organize and orchestrate the teams to work on things? And so the challenge is to you, is this an HR function, or is it the clinical manager's function of the area? And how do you, who takes lead, who drives it? How do you do it as an organization? Because you need to do it in scale, not in any one particular area.
And I think that was what was great about our last organization, was how in alignment we were, because there were really three entities that were driving this, and it was the clinical operations, training was sort of that mediator, and then HR. So training reported to me, and we were all sort of sitting in the room and saying, how do we do this? They had the problem. And I see my role as HR is to say, how can I drive outcomes from my seat being HR? And part of that is I have this big training department, and I can leverage those resources to make this happen. And so it was like, we're all just going to be, pushing to the same goal here. Very, very simple. Right. But yes, ultimately, this is not an HR initiative at all. This is an operational initiative that HR was 100% behind, because we understood what it took from training.
Yeah, that's where my mind was going too, that ultimately you need the manager, whatever the right title is, but the person who is the leader over an operating unit. the X-ray department, the eighth floor ortho nursing
Yes.
department, the ER, the pick your favorite department, and I'm leaning on clinical ones. You need that the leader of that area to recognize their ecosystem is changing and evolving, and they've got to adjust.
Right.
But you don't want them to invent the way they do it themselves. They won't necessarily know how to, and I don't mean it in any disparaging way, but that's not what they're right. And they need someone to provide them technical, kind of a horizontal and a vertical, right? They run the vertical, but who's running the horizontal of that function to equip them with the tools, technology and otherwise, so intellectual and otherwise, frankly, so that they can be better at running their vertical and not have to invent it themselves, right? How do you do that? And is that HR's job and training's job, but then they deploy it. It'd be interesting to understand that.
And secondarily to that, to add to that, part B, what are specifically some of the tools and technology that you've seen, heard about, or used that made that successful?
Yeah, I think honestly, from a technology standpoint, this was not really a technology push as much as as much as anything else, because there was a lot of classroom learning, like just because you had to sit for an exam. It wasn't something that you could just roll out a technology and do a lot of online learning. You had to be sitting, in front of an X-ray machine and, taking X-rays. So, but I think what really made it work was sort of what I was talking about before, and that is that alignment. A lot of project planning, but making sure everyone was on the same page. Our training team grew out of the clinic operations itself. And so because they understood what it was like to work in the clinics, they had the street cred right away. And so they could actually, in addition to, Dave, what you were talking about of sort of the manager drafting the people and getting them on board, the training team itself was able to do that as well, and sort of tap someone and say, hey, I think you'd be great for this. And so it was very much of a cohesive approach to it. And so I think that also allowed people who may have been a little tentative to take the leap and say, I feel like there's a lot of safety around me to do this, because my manager is saying it, my trainer is saying to do this. HR came up and said, hey, we got you. I think this would be something great for you. And that allowed people to go ahead and do it. And that was amazing for us.
Yeah. And just think, if you had, in addition, how do you again do that in scale? What type of information do you need to know about your workforce so that you know who to tap and who likely is going to be successful at it or not successful at it, or interested to begin with or not, that type of thing.
So interestingly, we were doing this at scale. We were doing this across 60 clinics.
Yeah. Wow.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, ironically, the one thing I didn't have, I wish I did, was a better pulse on my employee population. I use some great tools on the hiring side. And on the management side, I'm a big fan of predictive index. So we use that for hiring and for management. I didn't have a tool on the sort of HRIS side that would give me predictive analytics on my employee population, but this is where I would default because I had a great HR team in the field. So that would balance that out. But I didn't have like a great HR dashboard, electronic dashboard that I could pull up that would say like, oh, clinic, 102 is on fire or something like that.
So how did, I guess, to put a fine point on that conversation around recruiting, how did what you all were doing impact your recruiting efforts? Like what did it do to inform, and maybe Dave, this is more of what you're getting at, but how did it inform that recruiting process specifically? And did it change anything for you and your HR team?
Yeah, definitely. So I think with our recruiting, particularly with predictive index, we identified job specific profiles, and our retention was double what the industry standard was when we really honed our recruiting. And so I was there for about 5 years. And so, I had a really good run of being able to see that change over that time period. And so being able to identify, and this bringing it really sort of full circle to where we started, those people who are mission driven, um, and say, this is where I want to work. This is the industry in which I want to work, and being able to create that environment in which it doesn't feel like you're just being beaten up day in and day out, where you can throw other kinds of activities into their job. And that's what we tried to do. So, but hiring better at that front end was clearly key.
Yeah.
Or
Right.
again, the retention and turnover double the retention, half the turnover of what our industry was the key there.
Yeah, it just seems like the more you know about your team, and the earlier on you know it, the more comprehensive you can be about fitting, your analytics side, Michael, what you were getting at, right? How do you then start matching with people what their needs and development's going to be, their careers are going to evolve to, where they want to take risk, where they don't want to take risk, mutually back to the organization, the same thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is we almost laid out a playbook almost for how to approach this, and I think it's a great spot to sort of maybe end this conversation. But I want to continue it in a follow-up blog talking about sort of the future of healthcare workforce development. How can we look ahead 25 years into somebody's future, and pair that with opportunities, cross-training, reskilling, but aligning not only to their passions and mission, but then aligning that to the organization's mission. To your point, Michael, it sounds like that's sort of the differentiator, is that you got to have someone who aligns to the organization in more ways than one. Not just that they meet the skills necessary for the role. It's got to be much more than that if this is going to work, which is probably why we haven't seen many instances of this working across the industry, because I feel like most hiring is just reactive, right? Like, we need help and we're just going to hire temp people or whatever it is because we need it, and as opposed to looking at the long term. So I say we continue that conversation in a follow-up blog. Any last thoughts on this conversation, Dave?
I think what you just said, but I wouldn't necessarily label it only reactive. I think it's short term, right, versus long term. We hire to fill an immediate need. Healthcare, unfortunately, does not think 3 years out, 5 years out, 10 years out, whatever. We've never had that ability because it recalibrates and changes so quickly, and there's this pressure constantly there. And, at some point or another, that's such a disadvantage compared to thinking more longer term and matching individuals with organizations where they can have your whole, our billboard on the freeway shouldn't be, come work for us as a nurse and you'll make, we'll give you an extra day off a month. It should be
right.
Come spend your whole career with us. We will look out. We will help you navigate your whole career. We will we want you to be a fit for our organization forever, right? So to speak, right? How do you think that way, longitudinally, not just transactionally?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? I don't know, Michael. Now that's again a non-HR guy who always gets to tamper in the HR world. What do you really think about it?
Yeah, no, I think it's funny because I made a decision to leave health systems a while ago. And the last two companies that I've worked at, ironically, one of them being PE backed, this one being VC backed. So you'd think that the focus may even be more on fill the positions, get the numbers, let's see the results. In those two organizations, the focus has been more on quality of hire, fit with mission, than in any of the hospitals that I've ever worked in.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that's ironic or if that's just a true shift. And I think even more so in the organization I'm with now, because we're value-based care. And so it is very much so. And you know, I don't really do much recruitment unless we're talking about our physicians and physician leaders. And there the conversations are, if you're not a fit, you could be the best provider in the world. But if you're looking for a fee-for-service kind of environment, this is not going to be the role for you. So I'm hoping that is, you know, a bellwether that that's where we're moving. And that it's not just that it's those two organizations, but it's that those are more recent.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great
I
point.
hope you're right.
Yeah, exactly. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for the conversation. This was awesome. Look for more conversations like this with our team. And as always, thank you all for listening. Check you later. Take care.
A Higher Future in Healthcare is a production of IIA Healthcare, a healthcare technology company and creators of Interview IA, an interview platform for healthcare organizations to streamline their interview processes to deliver unparalleled candidate experiences and to create a true competitive advantage for delivering quality care. Learn more at www.iahealthcare.com.